By far the best and biggest Mario Kart game we'll ever get is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. With a total of 96 courses, it's hard for Nintendo to ever surpass this. Maybe in another 30 years it will happen though, we don't know. Anyway, why not go ahead and rank every single track in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, huh? This list will be based on how fun the tracks are to drive across, how original, creative and memorable they are, and of course my opinions on them as well. So without further ado, let's get started. 96 GameCube Dry Dry Desert. If you've been watching me for a while, you definitely saw this one coming. Dry Dry Desert just sucks in every way possible. Boring track design? Check. Easy to avoid obstacles? Check. Annoying course to drive on? Check. Not even the music is any good. It sounds better than the original, definitely. That was just garbage. And what also blows my mind is the fact that they somehow managed to make this track worse than the original. Yeah, they got rid of the tornado, the giant piranha plant in a quicksand hole that would eat you if you fell in, and they made the final section extremely boring by removing all the enemies and replacing it with water. Like I said, this track sucks, and not a little bit. 95 Animal Crossing. Most tracks tend to look exactly the same every time you play them, but Animal Crossing takes a pretty cool idea, which is to change seasons every time you select a track, and executes it very poorly. Don't get me wrong, this track looks absolutely stunning in all 4 versions, but it's only a visual and auditory change, and nothing about the track layout changes besides 1 or 2 ramps get added for the spring and summer seasons. There's no anti-gravity, no shortcuts, and not even a single obstacle in sight besides just one at the end, and even that one isn't present the entire time. This track is just boring all around. 94 GBA Cheese Land. Don't try to convince me that this track is made of cheese, because it's clearly just a glorified desert track. This track is honestly just miserable to drive on, due to the abundance of holes in the track. And most of this track is also way too slippery, and doing pretty much anything here feels incredibly awkward. Plus the fact that there's 2 shortcuts at the end makes this track even more unfair. The track layout is not terrible, but the fact that the course is so slippery and excruciating to drive on makes this one of the most painful tracks in the game. 93 3DS Toad Circuit, or a more appropriate name, Turd Circuit, because man, this track sucks. Not only is this by far the worst looking track in the game, but the layout is very basic and boring. The track is over before you know it, and while the occasional glider ramp is cool, I guess, the rest of the track has nothing to offer. It's not the worst track ever, obviously, but it just blows my mind why Nintendo even added this track to begin with. 92 SNES Mario Circuit 3. It's a SNES track and also a Mario Circuit track, so yeah, it's nothing special. At least the layout is more interesting than Toad Circuit though, and the aesthetics are also much better, with even cool block formations on the side. For the rest, you know what you're getting into. 91 Twisted Mansion. The more and more I played this track, the more I started to dislike it. I actually kinda hate this track a little bit now, but I can't really put my finger on why. I think the main reason is because this track tries to be original with its haunted house theme and its underwater section, but it utterly fails in most apartments. Some of the track is pretty cool, like this room with a waving carpet and the shortcut through the library, but that's literally the first 5 seconds, and the rest of the track is just a mess. A completely unfitting underwater section, awkward turns to drive through, and the rest of the track is just uninspired. It's not a terrible track, and sometimes I do enjoy it, but it's not great. 90 Mario Circuit. Hey, it's our good old friend Figure 8, but with a bit of a twist, quite literally. Because this track actually resembles more of a Mobius strip than a Figure 8, and the track does get slightly more interesting as a result. It's still nothing too great though. The turns are very wide and the piranha plants aren't difficult to avoid in the slightest. At least the track looks very nice, but a lot of tracks in this game look nice, so even that's not impressive. 89 Mario Kart Stadium. It's the first track in the game, and therefore it's of course gonna be low on the list. However, out of all the first Mario Kart tracks, this might be the best one. The layout is more interesting than most first tracks, since it's not just a Figure 8, and it also introduces the anti-gravity mechanic in a really good way. Plus, there's quite a lot of shortcuts for a first track. But while the layout is more interesting than most, it's still nothing out of the ordinary. And because it's also just pretty much a circuit track, it can also be so interesting and fun to play. 88 Water Park. Wow, what a cool name. Water Park is exactly what it sounds like, a park flooded in water, and it features some pretty cool stuff like a huge looping in anti-gravity and a pretty neat shortcut through these spinning cups. The music is also pretty catchy, perfectly fitting with the theme, but besides that, this track is really basic and pretty boring. 87 GameCube Sherbetland. This track was absolutely horrible to drive on in the original, and well, they sort of improved this track, but not that much. The main difference here is honestly just how the game controls, and of course in a much better better way. And of course we all know about the optional underwater paths, which are pretty cool, but sadly this track is still quite annoying to play and doesn't feature anything out of the ordinary. 86 Wee Moo Moo Meadows, a very calm and peaceful track, but also pretty boring. It's not all bad though. You get a nice drive along some cows, the track looks stunning, and the track design is pulled off incredibly well, even if it's very simple. But yeah, the track design is very simple, and the cows are also really easy to avoid. It's a fun enough track for what it tries to be, but of course it doesn't try to be much in the first place. 85 GBA Mario Circuit. It's another Mario Circuit track, but this time with a pretty cool design choice. Instead of this track being completely flat, part of it is now lifted high in the air by Ultra Hands, which are toys that Nintendo produced in the 60s. Now that is a very nice touch. This change does make the track stand out from the others, and while it's not a very significant change, the anti-gravity does help a little bit. Otherwise, this track is just pretty mediocre. 84 SNES Donut Plains 3. It's another SNES track, but this time it got a pretty decent glow up, classic Mario Kart 8 style. Donut Plains takes you across a wet road, shortly underwater, and avoiding some Monty moles jumping from the ground. The layout is more interesting than most SNES tracks, but it's still just a SNES track. The layout is more interesting, sure, but that still doesn't make it really interesting to play. 83 Hyrule Circuit. Yes, this track is Zelda themed, and yes, that is cool, but just look through that and you'll realize that this track is way more generic than it should be. The layout is pretty dull, some of the turns are very unsatisfying to master, and most of the track is completely devoid of any hazards. The sword in the castle is pretty cool, and you can even jump through it if you drive into the spin boost pillars in the hallway, but apart from that, this track is just way too basic. The track doesn't even look interesting. 82 GameCube Baby Park. The shortest track in the history of Mario Kart, but somehow extremely fun to play. I think it's because of the fact that it's so tiny. It makes the track super chaotic, helped even more due to the anti-gravity. There's a lot of action during the entire race, bouncing off other drivers and getting a speed boost, and also a lot of items to avoid. The fun is definitely here, but because this track is literally just a tiny oval, and also that sometimes the race can feel quite barren, it really can't go much higher. 81 Bone Dry Dunes. It's just your average desert track, and while it's better than most other desert tracks in the series, it's still nothing truly interesting. The layout is relatively forgettable, and most of the track doesn't have anything special going on. At least the difficulty is pretty much on spot, and there's some pretty decent side paths to drive across, like this wooden platform above the track. And the aesthetics are also just beautiful. It's one of the very few desert tracks taking place at dusk, and it makes for an environment that's very pleasing to look at. But even though the aesthetics are great, the track is still quite mediocre. 80 Sky High Sunday. When I first played this track, I was astonished by how fun it was. Tons of trick jumps, incredibly high speeds, anti-gravity, and many spin boost pillars. But the more I played it, the more I realized that this track is a lot more generic than I thought. The layout is literally just an oval, and the anti-gravity only makes it worse because of the floaty physics, which also makes every track feel less impactful than they should have been. It's not necessarily a bad track, but also pretty underwhelming. At least the music is still a certified banger though. 79 Excitebike Arena. A perfect representation of the Excitebike game from the SNES. There's a bunch of ramps to trick off and boosts to take, and the sheer amount of speed you get during this entire race makes it quite fun. The track also changes every race, which makes it feel pretty dynamic. However, just doing a bunch of tricks the whole time is not really good track design, and while the changing layout is pretty cool, most of the time it's hardly noticeable. 78 DS Cheap Cheap Beach. Them Cheap Cheaps do be here though, and so is the beach, but not only a beach, because there's also a boardwalk and a forest. I know, truly riveting. The track layout is okay. There's some water you can go in, some mud to avoid, and that's pretty much it. The track is quite forgettable, and even though the mix of themes is pretty nice, it's also pretty basic and pretty dull. 77 N64 Toad's Turnpike. A decently fun traffic course, but also ridiculously easy. The original was infamous for its almost unfair difficulty, and while this version isn't unfair, it's also not difficult either. And I feel like that was the main reason why this track was also quite fun. And while it still is somewhat enjoyable here, it is a shame that the track has been dumbed down so much. 76 GBA Sky Garden. This was one of the best from Super Circuit. The vibes were perfect, the course layout was very diverse for the time, and there were quite a few shortcuts throughout the track that were pretty nifty to take. But man, Sky Garden sucks in this game. Well, at least compared to the original. So many turns and curves got removed, and the amount of shortcuts is stripped down to just this very awkward leaf shortcut at the beginning of this track. And the worst part is, it's not even this game's fault. fault. It's because dumb Nintendo was lazy and ported it from Tor. The music is very good and the atmosphere is gorgeous, but man, the layout has been butchered to the freaking worst. 75 SNES Rainbow Road. Oh my god, another SNES track. But it's freaking Rainbow Road this time. How cool. The track looks freaking spectacular with the bright rainbow colors of the road, the detailed background, and even the rainbow colored thwomps. However, it's yet again just another SNES track. The layout is very simple, and while the wobbling road caused by the thwomps is pretty cool, the rest is pretty lame. 74 3DS DK Jungle. A track that isn't talked about much at all, and not without reason. Don't get me wrong, DK Jungle is a fun track and it has its highlights, but the highlights it does have are very minor. The theme is just okay. It has a giant temple, which is pretty cool, and there's even a giant spinning banana, because why not? But the track layout is pretty generic, and in terms of creativity, this track just doesn't really stand out in any way. It's not a bad track at all, just relatively forgettable. 73 GBA Sunset Wilds. Oh man, just thinking about this track makes me feel disappointed. Sunset Wilds was one of the best tracks from Super Circuit. A pretty fun layout, Shy Guys intends to avoid, and of course the setting sun as the main gimmick. But the entire gimmick of this track has been completely removed from this remake. Plus, it also uses the watered down layout from Tor, which makes it even worse. The Shy Guys are still here, and they're still fun to avoid, and the track looks stunning, but man, this track got done so dirty in this remake. 72 Sweet Sweet Canyon. It's a yummy candy land with treats, cookies, and even this weird orange soda drink or whatever it is. And the track design tries to accommodate for its theme, and does it pretty well. You drive around a huge cake and blast off from a donut into a long gliding section, and you can even take a shortcut through a donut. But besides that, the track is pretty basic, and the anti-gravity section is also pretty eh. 71 Ice Ice Outpost. I've always found this track to be underrated, and I can't really put my finger on why it's so overlooked. Sure, the track layout isn't super interesting, but it's still interesting enough to make the track fun to drive across. The gimmick of the road always being split in two can make for some interesting strategies, and of course you have those shortcuts which are always a challenge to take. The visuals are incredibly pretty, even though there's not a lot to look at. I just love these Arctic inspired looks for some reason, and the track is also not obnoxiously slippery, which is only for the better. For the rest, you know what you're getting into. 70 GameCube Yoshi Circuit. A track shaped like Yoshi? Well, of course. And it makes for one of the best circuit tracks we've seen. We all know Yoshi Circuit by now, being a fun and innocent circuit with some pretty difficult turns and cool aesthetics. There's some pretty cool shortcuts to take as well, and of course being modeled after Yoshi makes for a pretty intriguing layout. However, it's still just a circuit track though, and most of the track is pretty unremarkable. 69 GBA Snowland. An example of how to pull off a GBA remake in the right way. Instead of basically redesigning an entire track, Sky Garden, you make it very faithful to the original, and it works remarkably well. Of course, the layout is nothing interesting, but at least it doesn't suck, unlike Sky Garden. The environment also looks magical, and the pink hue of the sky and the giant crystals give off some serious chilly vibes. It's just a shame that this track is relatively generic, but it's still nothing too bad. 68 Dragon Driftway. A track based around Gobblegut from Mario Galaxy 2 is really cool to see, but it doesn't really make for the most memorable track, which is mostly due to the track being just a bunch of turns, which makes sense since it's themed around a Chinese dragon, and while those turns are satisfying to master, it also makes the track feel a bit forgettable. It's not a bad track at all, and it's still really fun, just a little bit unmemorable. 67 3DS Neo Bowser City. Some people hate this track and other people think it's amazing, but I don't really have a strong opinion on this track. The Utopian City theme is incredible, and it, along with the rain effect, makes this track look stunning. This track is also one of the most challenging in a game due to the abundance of sharp turns, which is also why some people dislike it so much, but I don't mind the challenge at all. The track design is relatively generic though, and the track doesn't really have anything noteworthy. 66 N64 Choco Mountain. This is an example of a track that was never too popular until they boosted the course pass. Choco Mountain was quite an obscure track from 64, being a barren chocolate-themed mountain with only a pair of boulders to worry about. But ever since Tor, the track got a huge upgrade, both visually and gameplay-wise. The track looks stunning in this game, with the fog, the cave, and the detailed textures on the walls, and the boulders are actually a threat now. It's still just Choco Mountain though, and apart from the boulders, it's basically just a plain road. 65 Tour Tokyo Blur. And now we've finally arrived at the city tracks, and this one is just okay. It's definitely the least interesting of the city tracks, but it does have some nice qualities. For one, the music music is absolutely slapping and gorgeous. It's probably the most Mario Kart-y a song can get, and I love every single bit of it. And the aesthetics are pretty decent. It's one of the most colorful city tracks in the game. But the layout and track design are pretty boring. It all kind of blends together and it's really easy as well. 64. Tour New York Minute. Slightly better than Tokyo, New York is pretty much only better because of its nighttime setting. Because while the track does look nice and very vibrant, the track layout is just as uninteresting, if not even more dull. At least there's some Goombas here, but Tokyo has thwomps, so yeah, guess which one's better. Well, at least the landmarks are more remarkable and the track is slightly more memorable, if anything. 63 and 64 Royal Raceway. Oh my god, it's a Mario Kart synonym for circuit. Call the police. Jokes aside, Royal Raceway is actually a decently fun track. The huge jump off the ramp with the dash panels leading up to it is super satisfying, and the layout is quite interesting and the vibes are also just really fancy and lush. But it's still pretty much just a circuit though. Jeez, I wonder how many times I said that already. 62 Tour Paris Promenade. This was the very first track in the Booster Course Pass, and it certainly didn't disappoint. The layout is, yeah, nothing too great, but there's a lot to love here, like the music and the vibes. But this track also gave us the moment where we realized what Nintendo was going to do with these city tracks, and I love it. The fact that this track goes backwards on the final lap makes for an unexpected but very welcome twist. It's just a bummer this track hasn't really aged the best. 61 DS Mario Circuit. One of the better Mario circuits in the series, or maybe even the best if you count remakes separately. By far the biggest revamp this track has had is that a small portion of the track was turned into a forest section. This gives so much life to a track that was originally quite bland and forgettable. There's even a wiggler that walks around, but unfortunately only on a third lap, and there's a possibility you don't even see the wiggler in a race at all. The rest of the track is nothing too special though, even though the layout is pretty good. 60 Wii Daisy Circuit. Still the best circuit track in the series, Daisy Circuit doesn't even really feel like a circuit. The sunset setting, the peaceful town aesthetics, and the layout is more interesting than most circuits. They also added a trick ramp and some huge dash panels around the lighthouse, which is a very neat addition. The track also looks gorgeous, from the detailed buildings to the nice sunset and patterned road. For the rest, you know what to expect. 59 Merry Mountain. Nope, not Tour Merry Mountain, but just Merry Mountain, because Nintendo. If you want to get into the holiday spirit at any time, then this is the track for you. There's snow everywhere, a bunch of Christmas themed decorations, and even several flying sleighs. This track just screams Christmas all around. Well, apart from one thing. Because while the visuals are stunning, the track design is very simple. There are some alternate paths and half-pipes to take, but they don't really add much to the race. 58 Tour Sydney Sprint. Why this city track gets so much love, I don't understand, seeing as it's always been just okay to me. Sure, it's a pretty pleasant track to drive on, but it's not really that much of an interesting one. I do have to admit that the track flows really well and the music is a certified bop. But while the track certainly flows nice, the track design is also pretty boring due to there being no obstacles and long turns and straightaways. Plus the visuals are also pretty mediocre. It's still a decent track though. 57 3DS Rock Mountain. This used to be one of the better tracks in Mario Kart 7, with epic gliding sections and realistic visuals. Unfortunately, this track was highly dependent on its realistic graphics, and that aspect of the track has just completely vanished in this remake. While the gliding sections are pretty cool, there's not much you can really do besides wait until you land, especially since there's nothing really great to look at. The track layout is also nothing special, and while the uphill section with the boulders is pretty fun and the cave is also quite cool, the rest is pretty basic. 56 Tour Singapore Speedway. For a track that screams chaos with its nighttime setting, bopping music, and vibrant graphics, it's ridiculously simple design-wise. And yes, I gotta admit that the track does look very good and the music is very good as well, but the layout is really basic. Lap 1 is cool, going through the Marina Bay Sands, but that's literally all that happens in Lap 1. Lap 2 is just going through Chinatown and nothing else, and it's really boring, and Lap 3 is admittedly really cool and long enough to leave a good last impression. But there's also so much missed potential here, it kind of makes me sad. 55 3DS Rosalina's Ice World. For a track that was pretty mediocre in the original game, it got a pretty decent glow up in the DLC. The track is absolutely stunning to look at, and I love the whole Mario Galaxy theming going on with the observatory next to the finish line and some of the most iconic planets in the sky. But while the vibes are really good, the track design is still relatively basic. The added half pipes are pretty nice, and avoiding the penguins and icicles is still really fun, but apart from that, it just doesn't really feature anything noteworthy. It's not a bad track at all, just just alright. 54 and 64 Yoshi Valley. A track with a lot of past 3 DLC is quite rare, but this one is quite neat. Yoshi Valley has always been known for its many different paths to take, and of course most of the track is built around this gimmick. You can take this cannon, this short cave section, or just a normal route. There's also a pretty cool shortcut at the beginning, and the rolling egg is always fun to avoid. There's not much more to this track though, and most of the paths just feel completely unnecessary. 53 DS Waluigi Pinball. Now hold on before cowardly smashing that dislike button, because I really need to explain something. Waluigi Pinball is always praised like it's the man Jesus Christ himself, but it really doesn't deserve the praise it gets, not even close. Yes, the aesthetics are amazing and the theme is incredibly cool, but everything else that's important about a Mario Kart track just lacks, and more than you would think. The layout of the track is extremely generic, doing some very simple turns and without a single shortcut or split path throughout the entire track. The pinball table section itself is literally just driving straight and hoping you don't get hit by a pinball, which even in itself is very unlikely to happen. The fact that they also had 3 opportunities to add something interesting to this track but didn't really shows something. It's still a pretty decent and pretty fun track, but by far not deserving of the praise it gets. 52 GBA Riverside Park. By far one of the most visually pleasing tracks from the Booster Course Pass, because damn, all those textures, that environment, it all looks so sappy. And the layout is also not half bad. Plus the added TUIs add even more to the race, and they make for a really weird but also very welcome obstacle to avoid. For the rest though, this track is relatively generic. 51 and 64 Kalimari Desert. A barren track from Mario Kart 64 that sprouted its life in its remake. Well, at least a little bit. Some parts of the track are still pretty empty, but the added train track route and beautiful visuals add a lot to the track already. And there's a neat split path in the 3rd lap. But for the rest, it's just Kalimari Desert, and there's not much more to say. It has always been a pretty solid one. 50 Tour Berlin Byways. Okay, this is gonna sound weird, especially because pretty much everyone else thinks the opposite, but I really hate this music and I really think it's garbage. Well, at least I like the first 10 seconds, but oh well, enough about the music. The track design is okay, I guess. The first lap is cool, driving through the Bahnhof, and the 3rd lap has the Berlin walls with womps to avoid, and that's pretty much it. The rest of the track is pretty much just road and avoiding traffic, and while that's fun to do on its own, it does make the track a little bit forgettable. 49 Tour London Loop. Seeing a city course with such a cloudy atmosphere is honestly a breath of fresh air, and the layout also perfectly sums up how London feels in real life, incredibly complex and all over the place. And a lot of people dislike this track purely for that reason, but I actually quite like the complicated layout, even if some parts can be a little bit dull. And the chain jumps during the 3rd lap are so cool. The fact that one type of obstacle can change up a race so much is really cool to see. Plus the music is a banger, just saying. 48 GBA Bull Lake. Holy shit, that music slaps hard. I never expected a full-on metal-like remix, but I really dig it. Bull Lake never really lived up to its name, but this remake finally does, adding a body of water below the entirety of the course. Not only do you drive underwater for half of the track, but also in anti-gravity. This track pulls off the underwater mechanics so much better than Twisted Mansion, since it feels a lot more natural and not out of place. The track can also get pretty intense sometimes, especially on Tour and CC. The boardwalk aesthetic is honestly kinda lame, but since it's the only track in the game like this, it's okay. 47 Rainbow Road. An underrated Rainbow Road in my opinion. This one always seems to be overshadowed by most other Rainbow Roads, but I never really hear any good reasons for it. Yes, the colors aren't very rainbowy, and compared to Wii's or 7's Rainbow Road, it's pretty underwhelming, but on its own, it's a pretty good track. It's difficult enough for a Rainbow Road, especially on Tour and CC, and the twisty roads and nifty shortcuts add a lot of chaos to the race. Really, this Rainbow Road needs to be recognized more. 46 Tour Vancouver Velocity. This is an example of a city track that starts off strong, but worsens the more it progresses. The first lap is just amazing. Driving on a suspension bridge in anti-gravity is very fun, and it makes for one of the best laps out of any city track, but the rest of the track kinda blends together. The ice rink is pretty cool, but the rest of laps 2 and 3 are so similar that I struggle to remember the differences between them. They're not necessarily bad laps on their own, but just a little bit forgettable and pretty bland. 45 The Ashroom Ridge. A ridiculously overlooked track, which I can sort of understand, but also not at the same time. Of course, this track is infamous for its average presentation and rather obscure existence, but is that all that matters here? Of course it isn't. Because yes, the graphics are pretty meh, but the gameplay itself is very fun. Dodging traffic is a joy to do, the layout is quite complex, complicated, and the music is an absolute banger. Even the shortcuts are pretty cool. This track is underrated, man. 44, Wii Mushroom Gorge. It's Mushroom Gorge, the good old classic from the Wii. For some reason, I feel like this version gets a lot of hate, even though it's literally better than 7's and Tour's and maybe even Wii's as well. But anyway, you know the drill by now. You drive through a valley and bounce off mushrooms for a bit, and it's still a good time. It is a pretty short track, but I think that's actually a good thing, considering it doesn't drag on for too long. This one is great. 43, Tour Bangkok Rush. It's the 10 millionth city track, and this one is pretty good. Despite the hate the skybox gets, I actually quite like it. It gives the track this beautiful pink-orange tint, perfectly accompanying the vibe of this track. The layout of the track is also not bad, though there is one long straightaway that gets pretty boring pretty quickly, but jumping on the market tents, driving through the river, and gliding over the monuments is very fun. It is quite a shame that a lot of obstacles like the carts and piranha plants were removed or dumbed down, but it's still a good track regardless. 42, DS Wario Stadium. A track that was very awkward to play on the DS, but pretty damn fun in this game. Wario Stadium is a track that has a lot of action, a bunch of boost panels and places to trick off, a fun anti-gravity section avoiding fire bars, and overall this remake revamps the track so much that sometimes it's pretty difficult to see the similarities. And that's not a bad thing at all. It's actually only for the better considering just how much action got added in this remake. This one is a goodie. 41, Toad Harbor. A beautifully calm and peaceful track. Well, apart from those cars which can absolutely demolish you, but whatever. This track takes place in a beautiful town, and the layout is pretty chill. Driving through a market, on the walls of toy stores, and down a slope with a bunch of boosts, also avoiding cable cars at the same time. And the music is just perfect. It fits the track insanely well. 40, Tour Rome Avanti. And suddenly we're in Italy, because thanks Mario Kart Tour, Rome is a pretty great city track, having a complex layout while being relatively easy to navigate. You drive through the Colosseum, across a plaza avoiding rocky wrenches and fuzzies, and you even go back to the Colosseum avoiding chain chomps. If I'm being honest, they could have had a little bit more variety in locations because the majority is just streets, but it's still a pretty damn fun track. 39, Thwomp Ruins. Taking a shift from the relaxing Toad Harbor and peaceful Rome Avanti, Thwomp Ruins is a huge contrast in theme. There's no time for jokes here, be ready to avoid thwomps and even rolling millstones. There's also a very neat fork with a lot of split paths. Wanna go underwater? You can. Wanna ride on a wall? You can as well. And that shortcut at the end is very nifty. This track's pretty neat. 38, GameCube Daisy Cruiser. A very relaxing track with a really unique theme, taking place on a freaking cruise ship. And everything that's on a cruise ship is also here. A nice little pool, a dining room with sliding tables, an underwater cellar with unagis, which is, yeah, pretty dangerous, but pretty freaking cool. And for the rest, this track is just pretty chill. 37, DS TikTok Clock. A track that was quite dull and empty in the original, but my god, this remake is the complete opposite. The entire track comes to life here. It looks phenomenal, the music doesn't sound cringy, and there's just so many details to look at. Plus, the track doesn't feel awkward to play due to the much better and smoother controls. It's still nothing too special though, and the theme carries most of this track, but it's still a very fun one. 36, DS Peach Gardens. A very cool setting for a track, taking place in some sort of royal hedge maze in front of Peach's castle, and the track design perfectly resembles a maze. You have a bunch of flower beds to avoid, and even a small maze with chain chomps jumping around, and the added piranha plant is very nice. And my god, the first time that final lap happened, it really caught me off guard, and it's so cool to just fly through the statues like it's nothing and watch the chain chomps roam about. Even though the difficulty from the original has vanished quite a bit, this track is still a bunch of fun. 35, Tour Los Angeles Laps. Oh my god, having no dumbass vocals in this rendition is just orgasmic for me, and I really couldn't be any happier. And the layout is one of the most interesting out of all the cities, since it combines Tour's variants as sections instead of laps. You go through so many locations, like the Santa Monica Pier, the oil field, and you even glide over Dodger Stadium. Definitely one of the best city tracks in the game. 34, Tour Madrid Drive. I'm getting quite tired of talking about these city tracks, but here's Madrid, I guess. The theme is admittedly pretty boring, but the layout is very interesting. Going through the market, avoiding a wiggler, a mall with piranha plants, through the museum with beautiful artwork, and even a football stadium avoiding footballs. There's a lot to look at here, even if there's not much more to say because of the abundance of cities in the game. 33, N64 Rainbow Road. There's quite a few mixed opinions on this track, but I personally love it. And my god, that beautiful song almost makes me cry inside. They've managed to turn one of the most boring tracks from the N64 power into such a wonderful and gorgeous experience. The turns are super satisfying to master, there's a bunch of boosts to take, and the chain jumps make the road wiggle, and they're even pretty difficult to avoid. This track is great. 32. SNES Bowser Castle 3. Without a doubt, the biggest glow up any SNES track has ever received, and even that's an understatement. There's so much elevation now, and the wall section in the end is incredibly cool. You have so many options here, and it's pretty difficult to stay on the walls, which makes it even more fun. There's also a cool anti-gravity section, and even some very cleverly placed thwomps at the end. For a SNES track, this one is incredibly impressive, but unfortunately it just doesn't beat out 31. Bowser's Castle. An underrated Bowser's Castle in my opinion, and slightly better than the SNES one. It always gets overshadowed by the castles from Wii or Double Dash, but I've always found it much more interesting than most other Bowser's Castle, besides the one from Wii. There's a bunch of obstacles to avoid, including some fire bars, pendulums, lava geysers, and even a giant Bowser statue that punches its fists into the track. The track also has a bunch of sharp turns to nail, and the rocking tune in the background only makes it even more hectic. This Bowser's Castle is great, even if it's still not as good as Wii's. 30. Wii Wario's Gold Mine. Wario has a gold mine, of course he does. This track is the closest we can get to a roller coaster in Mario Kart, as there's a bunch of drop downs, speed boosts, and jumps to take. There's also mine carts which you can run into to get a speed boost, which does remove an element of difficulty, but gives this remake its own flair and fun value. This track is just a zany experience from start to end. 29. Tour Amsterdam Drift. One of the liveliest city tracks in the game, and also one of the most underrated. There's a bunch of locations you go to. Glide over the train tracks, through the fields avoiding Monty moles, underwater in a single canal, and even through a tulip field with piranha plants. And of course you can't forget about the trams you gotta avoid, and the fact that you even come across other drivers on the third lap. There's very few boring moments during this track, and the vibes are just jolly overall. This track is so much fun. 28. Tour Athens Dash. By far the best city track in the game, and this city track doesn't even feel like one. And that's mainly because it doesn't actually take place in a metropolitan area, but it's themed more around Athens ruins, specifically the Acropolis. Driving on small pillars, going around the Theater of Dionysus, and overall the distinctive nature this track has that other city tracks just don't have makes it stand out so much more in all the right ways. And that's ironic because again, it's not even really in a city. 27. Electrodrome. This track just screams party, and that's only amplified by literally everything going on here. The music sets the vibe perfectly, and you can even hear clapping and Shy Guy singing to the music sometimes. The layout is also just riveting, and the entire track is decorated with party stuff like speakers, disco balls, and even a giant screen showing the Shy Guys dancing to the song. Now that's cool, and man, those turns at the end are so dazzling to go through. This is such a banging track. 26. Mute City. If you purely want speed, then this is a track for you, because Mute City doesn't just have one boost panel, but no, about a billion or something. Every single moment of this track, you're going insanely fast, taking very sharp turns or taking a huge leap of faith because of the anti-gravity. This track just feels like a huge rush, and I love it. There's not much more to it, but it's still very fun to get a bunch of speed the entire time. 25. Cloud Top Cruise. Driving on the top of clouds? Now that's cool. And not only do you drive on clouds, but also on an airship avoiding crates, and even through a freaking thunderstorm avoiding lightning bolts. There's also so many Easter eggs in this track, like the huge vine growing out of a question mark block, or the incredible arrangement of Gus the Gardening Galaxy in the music. While the track is somewhat short, every moment here is a blast and really memorable as well, even if the Thundercloud section could have been a little bit more difficult. 24. Piranha Plant Cove. It's a city track that's also not a city track, and my god, the shift in scenery from the majority of the cities is so refreshing, and I really like it. You go underwater for most of the track, and while the first lap is pretty empty, the other two are great. You avoid thwomps, eels, and there's a very nifty shortcut through a shipwreck. And I also love the entire vibes and theming of this track. This setting with the desolate underwater ruins always caught my eyes, and the track looks beautiful as well. 23. 3DS Piranha Plant Slide. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like this track is underrated, but also not at the same time. I don't know. Anyway, if you ever wanted 1-2 from Super Mario Bros. In a Mario Kart game, then this is the track for you. It's got the pipes, it's got the underground, and the vibe is just perfect thanks to the amazing music. The entire track goes by lightning fast because of the rushing water, which is of course a good thing. 22. GameCube GameCube DK Mountain. It's DK Mountain, a classic from Double Dash. By now we all know what you do here, getting blasted to the top of the mountain and driving all the way down, avoiding boulders and cracks in the road and tricking off as many things as possible. It's insanely fun to do. And man, those two hairpin turns are so cool to drive through. You really gotta have your drifting game on point here or else you're screwed. And of course that shaking bridge at the end is still here trying to ruin your race. This track will always be an iconic goodie. 21. Wii Grumble Volcano. This track gets a lot of mixed opinions, but I personally love it. A lot of people don't like this track for how quote-unquote unfair or difficult it is, but come on, stop whining and learn to play the game, and then you'll realize how amazing this track actually is. There's lava everywhere, the layout is exhilarating, and there's also fireballs and fire snakes to avoid at the end. Plus, I didn't even mention the fact that the road crumbles over time, which is just really cool. Nothing about this track really seems unfair, it's only just straight fun. 20. Ninja Hideaway. The fact that a Wave 1 track is still so high on the lists really says something, because this track is just so good. Ninja Hideaway is a very intense track, with a bunch of split paths throughout the entirety of it, and a bunch of places to trick off. In fact, the race literally begins with you jumping off a rooftop. How much more trick emphasized can a track get? And there's also moving ceilings with shurikens, freaking Ninja Hideaways disappearing and leaving behind bananas, and the track is also quite difficult, which I really like. 19. Yoshi's Island. A track themed around this similarly named Yoshi's Island game sounds like a really cool idea, and it surely delivers. The track is basically a giant love letter to the Yoshi's Island game. The track is shaped like the island the game takes place on, driving around several of its locations like the overworld and castle. And there are so many tiny references to the game, like Poochie on a mailbox, Stilt Guys, and of course the flying question mark cloud. In terms of theming and aesthetics, this track gets a huge 11 out of 10, but if I'm being honest, the layout and track design are a little bit on the simple side. The track is still really fun to drive across though, even if the layout could have been slightly more interesting. 18. Wii Moonview Highway. Hey look, another banger track from Wii, and yes, let's get out of the way that there's not as much traffic as in the original, but even then this track still kicks ass. The music slaps, the graphics are gorgeous, and the many boost panels really give you that rush that not many other tracks can replicate. And the boost panels even randomly change positions, giving this remake a much appreciated dynamic element. And even though there's less traffic, there's still enough to avoid so that it's still very fun. And I'm also just glad we got this and not, you know. 17. Super Bell Subway. Damn, now we're gonna take the train all of a sudden? Meh, we're still driving carts. Instead, you have to avoid the train in a cramped tunnel. Now that's a twist. And damn, it's ridiculously fun to avoid them for some reason. There's a bunch of pretty tricky turns to master, and doing that while keeping an eye on the trains adds an element of awareness that only this track can provide. And don't forget about the 1-2 references all over the track. This track is fantastic. 16. Shy Guy Falls. A gorgeous track with an amazing charm to it. I mean, the Shy Guys sing along to the music like an Electrodrome, only even better. Besides that, you know what this track is all about. Driving up and down waterfalls while taking boosts is super fun and really creative, and the speed you get from the rapid water makes it even more frantic. The track is pretty short, but man, it is so much fun and really memorable. This track is enjoyable all around. 15. GameCube Waluigi Stadium. If tricking is your game, then this is the place to go, because there's a crap ton of bumps in the road throughout the whole track and even half-pipes. While the half-pipes in Wii didn't add too much to the race, the ones here have a really good purpose, since there's now optional anti-gravity roads above the track giving you a couple of speed boosts. And my god, this new addition is so cool. It really adds such a unique element to this track. For the rest, this track is still just your good old Waluigi Stadium. This has always been a fun one. 14. Dolphin Shoals. Most underwater tracks in Mario Kart are pretty dull, but Dolphin Shoals takes an underwater track and flips it on its head, because there's quite a lot of things going on in here. There are dolphins jumping out of the water and through floating rings, a bunch of pipes blowing air currents to trick off, and a giant unagi waving its tail around, allowing for some sweet tricks as well. And don't forget about that legendary saxophone solo in the background, complementing the race in the best possible way. This track is fun all around and a joy to listen to as well. 13. Wild Woods. God, this music is just the definition of heaven. Wild Woods takes place in a sweet magical forest village with Shy Guys roaming about, and the track design is just straight up fun, doing very twisty turns on tree trunks, a boardwalk entering a Shy Guys village, and going down a water slide and going across lily pads with boost panels on them. This track encourages speed all the time, and my god, does it look stunning as well. I love this track, it's really an underrated gem. 12. 3DS Music Park. This is sort of the same thing as Electrodrome, but it does more stuff with its theme. Driving on musical instruments such as pianos and xylophones is oh so satisfying. The track even plays along with the music when you drive on top of them, which is a really nice touch. You also can't go wrong with head-popping piranha plants and the giant bouncing music notes that makes the entire ground shake so hard that you literally bounce off of it. And of course you can't forget that music, it's so classic and catchy. This track is great. 11. Sunshine Airport. It's Sunshine Airport, a timeless classic. I mean, you drive through an airport and glide with the planes. How much more original can a Mario Kart track theme get? And that's not even all, because you also drive under an airplane and through an airplane. And driving on the entirety of this floating platform is one of the most satisfying things to do in the whole game. And man, the pacing here is just phenomenal. Things that are normally dreadful to experience at an airport are made so much funnier, and it's great. 10. Wii DK Summit. Damn, Mario Kart Wii literally only has bangers, doesn't it? DK Summit, even though the name is terrible, is a very enjoyable track. You start by getting blasted from a cannon, and immediately you're greeted by half-pipes and you just have to take them. There's also a bunch of bumps in the road, a very cool S-turn, of course infamous for the gap shortcut, and even snowboarding Shy Guys. And god, those half-pipe physics are so janky, but so much fun as well. How can you not love this track? Like seriously. 9. GBA Ribbon Road. Talk about a freaking glow up, this remake is the definition of it, but squared. The original Ribbon Road was already a pretty good track, taking place in some sort of fantasy world with presents in the background, and my goodness, this remake enhances the track so much visually it's hardly recognizable at first sight. The track now takes place in a bedroom instead, and there are insanely many details to look at. Plus the track design is very fun and it offers quite a unique challenge as well, especially when going for the shortcuts. This track is fantastic. 8. Wii Coconut Mall. This track gets a bad reputation because of the over-exaggerated color scheme in his remake, and yes, the graphics are not the best for this track, but the rest of the track still delivers really well. You still drive through a mall, tricking on pretty much everything you can, and you can still take a shortcut through a shop and race across an indoor garden. And even though the outside section is easier, the fact that the Shy Guys now do donuts is really cool. It tries to maintain the charm the original has, and it does it in great ways. 7. Wii Maple Treeway. Another Wii masterpiece, and this time it's Maple Treeway. This remake is very faithful to the original while sprucing up the visuals as well. You still drive through a maple forest on tree trunks and the top of trees avoiding wigglers, and it has always been a great time. The glide section is definitely not as invigorating as the bouncing net from the original, but it's got its own flair to it. There's so much variety in visuals. This track never gets boring at any moment. 6. Wii Koopa Cape. It's Koopa Cape. Need I say more? Well, okay, the underwater tube section is, yeah, worse than the original, but at least it's not bad like in 7 or Tour. But even if the tube section is worse than the original, it's still very fun, just like the rest of the track. The anti-gravity and boosting pillars give you this certain feeling that this track has always been so good at. Getting carried by the rushing water and driving along a cliffside is so much fun, and the fact that this track is scaled down here makes it more frantic in a really good way. I don't really need to say much more, do I? We all know this is a phenomenal track. 5. Big Blue. The definition of absolute chaos, but then in a really good way. Big Blue is one of the few tracks in the game which uses 3 sections instead of laps, and it makes use of them in a really good way. If there was one word to describe this track, it would be speed, because holy crap, the majority of this track only incentivizes you to go faster and faster, driving over conveyor belts, through rushing water, or even more conveyor belts. And that, oh yeah, the final lap from the announcer at the end gives you all the adrenaline you need for that final section. If you're looking for some crazy times, then this is the place to go. 4. Squeaky Clean Sprint. The fact that a track originally planned for Tour ended up being so ridiculously good is a miracle. It's a bathroom themed track, and there's so much that this track does with its theme. It's even kind of like Grimmer Road on steroids. Going through a sink, a bathtub, driving on sponges and tricking off bath bombs, through a freaking drain, and the entire track feels like a glorious mess while being incredibly consistent and coherent at the same time. And there's also so many split paths here, it really takes more than one race to fully explore this track. This track will never get old, it's just pure top-notch Mario Kart content. 3. 3DS Rainbow Road. This is often considered to be the best Rainbow Road in the series, and I can definitely see why. This track feels more like an adventure than a race, and while it might not be the most difficult Rainbow Road, it is definitely the most welcoming and special one. Driving on Saturn's rings, on the moon, across a bunch of speed boosts inside a rotating vortex, this Rainbow Road truly is the most ambitious one. And the road also just looks beautiful. This entire track is just phenomenal. 2. Wii Rainbow Road. Even though 3DS Rainbow Road might be more ambitious, the Wii one is much more difficult and slightly more fun to play. There's a crap ton of boosts and jumps to take, and the layout is so much fun and even difficult. And while all of that is true, they even managed to make the track feel really good while in anti-gravity. Now that's a really impressive accomplishment from Nintendo. This one will always be a classic, and this remake also manages to look gorgeous at the same time. And number 1 is of course Mount Wario. I mean, what else can it be? Mount Wario has always been the GOAT when it comes to everything that makes a Mario Kart track great. Where do I even begin? Jumping out of a helicopter at the start, driving on an icy road that is surprisingly enough not annoyingly slippery to drive on, going inside a cavern with rushing water and many places to do tricks off, driving on the side of a freaking dam while getting pushed by the waterfalls. Then you go through a forest with a bunch of trees in the way, a ski slope. Man, this track will never cease to amaze me every single time I play it. It's by far the most unique and fun Mario Kart track ever made, and I didn't even mention how beautiful the graphics are or how perfectly fitting the music is with the different variants and the incredibly detailed arrangements. All of this easily makes Mount Wario the best track in the entire game and in the entire Mario Kart series as well. Alright, but that was it for this video, guys. The truth is, the vast majority of these tracks are super fun to play. The game just has such a good engine that it's really hard to not enjoy a track. And of course, some tracks are worse than others, but most of them are really fun. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and do more of that fancy stuff. And I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye!